Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on clean hydrogen, green versus blue hydrogen, and its role in our clean energy future. I'm Joe Warchunas here, as always, with my teammate Brian Stewart. We'll introduce our guests, Robert and Martina, in just a second. But today we're talking about hydrogen. Very exciting. Those of you who follow us closely might know we did a webinar with Martina as a panelist last year on hydrogen. I'll put that in the chat in just a second. And last year's webinar kind of focused on the uses of renewable hydrogen. Today we're going to zero in on how we make hydrogen. So a really important discussion and how we can do that renewably. So for those of you who are new to Electrify Now webinars, we are an all-volunteer organization that tries to boil down our message and our efforts at decarbonization into four easy points. One, clean up your electric supply. So that means either putting solar on your roof or buying into your utilities clean energy plan or signing up for community solar. Two, electrify your home. And we've got videos on our YouTube page on how to do that, from heat pump water heaters to central heat pump systems, you name it. Number three is electrify your ride. If that's an electric car, electric bike, running on electrons is vastly cleaner. And then four, electrify everyone. We'll talk about that in just a second, how to spread the benefits of electrification to everybody. We want to say, as always, thanks to our over 40 members on our Electrify Coalition. These are nonprofits, for-profits, trade organizations that believe in electrification as a road to decarbonization. So if you're interested in joining, please contact Brian or I, and we'll put our emails in the chat. A huge thank you. For those of you who follow our webinars, you know that we monthly raise money for the Electrify Everyone Fund. This is a fund that we partner together with Community Energy Project to replace old polluting gas water heaters with new efficient heat pump water heaters in income qualified households. Just through our webinars alone, we've raised just about $4,000 last year. We've installed over 50 heat pump water heaters since the program started in late 2020. So thank you for donating and thanks for helping this program out. Now, we have to give a plug for next March, next month's webinars. We're doing Sequestration Week 2. For those of you who joined us last year, we had over 2,200 people from 50 different countries in Sequestration Week 2 and Sequestration Week 1. This year, we're going to be talking about carbon sequestration, giving an overview. We're going to be talking about regenerative agriculture, direct air capture, and sequestering at home. So don't miss Sequestration Week 2. We'll be sending out lots of info. And I should say that last year we had, just in Sequestration Week, we had people from 50 different countries. Today's webinar for hydrogen, we have folks representing from 34 different countries. So as we like to say, go ahead and, if you feel comfortable, put your where you're hailing in from today in the chat, and we'd love to hear where everybody is coming from. All right, Brian, why are we focusing on hydrogen today?
Thanks, Joe. So I think, even since we did this webinar on clean hydrogen last year, so much has changed and so much more energy is building around hydrogen. And some people might be new to this conversation. Some people maybe have some familiarity with how hydrogen, the importance it might play in our future. But just backing up, there's a lot of reasons to be interested in hydrogen, and it has a lot of compelling attributes, let's say. First of all, it's super abundant. I think it is the most abundant element in the universe. I'm not exactly sure how we know what's out in the universe, but here on Earth, it's definitely the most abundant element. It can be burned for heat, which is very useful, as all of you know. It can also be used in reactions with oxygen in kind of like a battery. If you want to think of it as a battery, like it's called a fuel cell. And when it reacts with oxygen, it can produce electricity. And both of these forms of energy use produce virtually no pollution and virtually no greenhouse gases. So it's quite attractive from all those standpoints. So you can see why people might be thinking, wow, maybe hydrogen could be a really important carbon neutral replacement for some of our current fossil fuels and play an important role in our clean energy future. So today, for the most part, hydrogen is used in many different ways, but primarily the vast majority of it's used for part of the oil refining process to make the fossil fuels that we consume ubiquitously. And it's also an important element in producing fertilizer. And those two uses are currently the highest uses of hydrogen. But going forward, because of those attributes that we mentioned earlier, people imagine that it could play a really important role as maybe the primary energy source to produce the high heat that's required for industry. Think about making steel, for example, where you need really high temperatures, and electrification might be difficult to achieve that. It's also attractive because it's got relatively high energy density, and it can be stored and transported. So that makes it potentially a really great use for commercial transportation, trucking, shipping, even aviation. And then it's also, because you can store it relatively indefinitely, it's potentially a great fuel for dispatchable electricity generation. This can be thought of as, backup electricity generation for a building like a hospital perhaps, or on a grid scale level, it could be potentially replacing a gas-powered power plant to provide energy when the wind and the sun are not cooperating. So it has a lot of attractive potential uses. So then quickly, the conversation has to turn to how you produce hydrogen in the first place, because while it's relatively, very ubiquitous, it doesn't occur very often as a single element. You have to extract it from chemical combinations. So today, it's primarily being produced by methods that use coal and methane as energy source. Those are referred to as brown hydrogen or gray hydrogen. It's very energy intensive to produce hydrogen, pure hydrogen, and it's very carbon intensive. There is a lot of work going on around using new carbon capture and storage technology to apply to either coal or primarily, I believe, methane operations to extract the carbon that was created by making the hydrogen and storing it to potentially get to carbon neutral versions of hydrogen. We're going to be talking more about that today. And then the other method that's really attractive is using renewable electricity to drive an electrolysis process where you're deriving it from water and getting what's called green hydrogen. We're not really going to be talking about brown and gray much today. We're going to be mostly focusing on blue and green and the differences and why it's important to really understand how these two things are not the same. So that brings us to the topic for today, green versus blue hydrogen. And we're going to be asking and answering questions like how green or how sustainable or carbon neutral, whatever word you want to use, is blue hydrogen really? Can carbon capture and storage technology make production of hydrogen carbon neutral? Is it possible? What is the role of methane emissions in hydrogen production? Because one of our panelists, which we'll be introducing, is also really an expert in methane emissions. And then we'll be pivoting a little bit back to the subject of green hydrogen and what are the most promising potential uses of green hydrogen and what's going on. A lot has changed in the years since we talked about this last. What are the applications that are being tested today for green hydrogen? We've got two great panelists to help us with this conversation today. First of all, we've got Professor Robert Howarth. He's editor-in-chief of biogeochemistry at Cornell University. He holds a PhD from MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he conducts much of his laboratory research on coastal marine ecosystems, but he also has done a lot of study around biofuels and greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas. So he will be primarily speaking to us about the research he's been doing around blue hydrogen and why we should be well informed about the realities of that process. And then we'll be joined by Martina Steinkusz. She's the Director of Marketing Development for the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance. RHA is part of our Electrify coalition, and they promote the use of renewable electricity to produce hydrogen and other climate-neutral fuels to replace fossil fuels consumption. Martina has a master's degree in urban studies from the University of Vienna in Austria and has extensive experience in urban energy, smart grids, and European small-scale hydropower policy and implementation. So welcome to both of our distinguished panelists today. And with that, I'm going to key up Professor Howarth's presentation. Let me just grab that.
Thank you for that, Brian. As soon as you get my slides up, we'll start talking about blue hydrogen.
All right, let's see. Here we go. Take it away.
Okay, excellent. So the question I want to address is how green exactly is blue hydrogen? And just a little bit of background. I live in the state of New York, and we have a very progressive climate law that says we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions statewide from all sectors by 40% in the next 8 years and be carbon neutral by 2050. And in New York, where cold climate, our number one source of greenhouse gas emissions is heating our homes and commercial buildings. So I'm on a commission that's charged by law with developing the implementation plan for that. We've been working for a couple of years on it now. And we were informed, for lack of a better word, by the fossil gas industry that perhaps the best thing we could do would be to promote the use of blue hydrogen as a replacement for gas and continue to use some sort of fuel for heating our homes, existing infrastructure, substituting in hydrogen instead of fossil natural gas. I was skeptical of that from the start, but it made me want to look at depth as to exactly what the greenhouse gas footprint of blue hydrogen is, and that's my focus today. So next slide, Brian. So Brian's mentioned that there are many different types of hydrogen. These are the primary ones, although there are others. So again, hydrogen from coal, we call brown hydrogen. If we make hydrogen from natural gas, fossil gas, we call it gray hydrogen. The blue hydrogen that I'm primarily focused on is the same as gray hydrogen, only with carbon capture and storage, in theory, to reduce its greenhouse gas footprint. And then the green hydrogen is from electrolysis using 100% renewable electricity. Next slide. We're going to talk towards the end and with Martina in particular about the role of green hydrogen in our energy future. And I'm less bullish on it than some, although I clearly believe that there's a role for green hydrogen in our future. Certainly for on-site storage, when we have surplus renewable electricity, and probably for other hard to decarbonize needs such as steel manufacturing and maybe long distance transportation. Well, we can talk about that more at the end. But next slide, let's look at the blue hydrogen case. Today, 96% of all the hydrogens produced globally is coming from fossil fuels, and that's more or less true here in the United States and Europe as well. In the US and Europe, this all comes from natural gas. Most of the hydrogen in China is coming from coal. So natural gas is mostly methane. It's over 90% methane, and that's the feed product for hydrogen in this process. And the process is to take the methane and natural gas, put it under incredibly high heat and pressure, add a little bit of steam, and the methane decays into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And we call that steam methane reforming, SMR. It's a technology that's been around for more than 120 years, and it's more or less unchanged, really. It's how hydrogen is made today in the United States. In addition to natural gas being the feedstock for this, the natural gas is also burned, other natural gas is also burned to provide the heat and pressure that powers the process. And this is called, again, gray hydrogen. Has very high greenhouse gas emissions, and no one really debates that. Next slide. So blue hydrogen, again, is the same, except it's combined with carbon capture and storage. And it's a new concept. The term was first used by the French firm Air Liquide, the French gas company, in 2015, pretty recently. And it's been highly promoted really just since 2017, particularly by the Hydrogen Council, which is a creation of the oil and gas industry. They were established by BP, Shell, and Total back in 2017. And they're very, very keen on selling blue hydrogen. To date, there are really only 2 facilities globally that have tried to make blue hydrogen in any sort of commercial sense. There's one in Texas and one in Alberta. And we have data available on the effectiveness of both of those. So next slide. So blue hydrogen is pretty widely promoted, again, by the oil and gas industry as sometimes they call it a zero emissions fuel. Sometimes they say low emissions or nearly zero emissions. And this is from a website for an Alberta company that's promoting it, nearly zero emissions. Next slide. And I just want to point out that it's a little bit more complicated than this website would suggest. The natural gas is the feedstock there. And in addition to producing carbon dioxide that they're trying to capture, you cannot use and develop natural gas without having some of it escape to the atmosphere unburned as methane, what we call fugitive methane emissions. And I've worked for a long time on that, as Brian says, and so I was aware that this would increase the greenhouse gas footprint of blue hydrogen to some extent. In addition, where at the bottom it says steam is coming in, that steam comes from burning natural gas, so there's carbon dioxide emissions associated from that and more methane emissions. And then for the carbon capture, that takes energy, and that energy also is coming from burning more natural gas with its own emissions as well. So next slide. For those of you who don't think about methane, I want to just take a couple of minutes and tell you why we should be concerned about methane. And methane emissions are a major contributor to the greenhouse gas footprint of blue hydrogen. Methane is rising rapidly in the atmosphere. This shows the global concentration. It was steady for the start of this century, but it's been rising rapidly. The last year rose more rapidly than ever before. And my research suggests that the largest single cause of this global increase in methane is shale gas development in the United States. Next slide. And today, over 70% of the natural gas in the United States and Canada is coming from shale gas. And so that's likely to be the driver behind blue hydrogen in North America. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with their newest global synthesis on climate change just last August, and it highlights methane like never before. So to the left of this slide, there are two bars there saying net warming and total warming agents. Bottom line is that for the last decade compared to before the Industrial Revolution, the human activities warmed the planet by 1.1 degrees compared to the pre-industrial baseline. The total result of warming gases is more than that. It's about 1.5, but there's some cooling gases too, sulfur dioxide primarily. So it's the sum of those that gives that net warming. The next panel over shows what carbon dioxide and methane are doing for this. So carbon dioxide is the major driver of that warming, but not by far. Methane is pretty close behind it, and nothing else really compares. Next slide. So in fact, 45% of all global warming to date is coming from methane, and the methane contribution is about 2/3 of that is carbon dioxide. It's important. Next slide. A few years ago now, back in 2015, the nations of the world came together and agreed that we need to address climate change and that we need to try and keep the planet well below 2 degrees Celsius, recognize that 1.5 degrees is dangerous. And I'm here to tell you that we can't reach that target without reducing methane emissions and doing so dramatically and soon. Next slide. And the United Nations followed up with the COP26 meeting in Glasgow just last November. I was there, as well as in the COP21 meeting in Paris, and there's a huge amount of excitement in this November meeting about methane. Countries of the world now say, yeah, we really need to hit that 1.5 degree target, and we need to reduce methane to do it. President Biden was there and committed the United States to reducing methane emissions by 30% over the next 8 years. And 100 other countries of the world agreed to do the same. We can't do that and continue to expand our use of fossil gas. Next slide. The reason methane is so important, and I'll move on to blue hydrogen soon, but this is an important slide. This shows the rate of global warming from 1900 up to 2011, that jagged line. This is from a paper that was published in 2012, so it was showing projections into the future. And again, we want to keep the planet below 1.5, which is shown by the bottom of that yellowish line there. And there are 4 trajectories here. The top line, green line, that's labeled reference, is what would happen if we made no effort to reduce any greenhouse gas emissions. That's more or less where we are, and that's more or less the trajectory we're on. The next line down that says CO2 measures is what would have happened had we back in 2011 aggressively. We shoot right through the 1.5 still in about 8 years from now. The next two lines down are what would happen if you reduce methane emissions as well as soot, and the bottom one also carbon dioxide. The point is that by reducing methane emissions, we immediately slow the rate of global warming, and that is the only way we're going to hit those COP21 and COP26 targets. So we need to reduce methane. Next slide. So that takes me to blue hydrogen, and working with Mark Jacobson, who's an expert on carbon capture and storage, an engineer at Stanford. I published a paper last summer. It's one of the very few peer-reviewed analyses that looks at the greenhouse gas footprint of even gray hydrogen, let alone blue hydrogen. And we're the first to include methane in the greenhouse gas footprint of either of those gases. So I want to run through what we did and what our conclusions are. Next slide. So it's a very simple, straightforward analysis. It's a readable paper, I'm told. There are four primary inputs to our life cycle assessment. One is the rate of methane emissions, and we used an assumption of 3.5%. We also did a sensitivity analysis going down to what I think would be the lowest possible real world methane emissions, as well as a higher number that's entirely plausible as well. We looked at the time frame over which we compare methane and carbon dioxide, because methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere for as long, and so the time frame of comparison is critical. And we used a 20-year time period, but we explored some other time frames as well. And then we looked at the data on carbon dioxide capture from the steam methane reforming process. We used actual data from the two plants, and we were a little optimistic. We gave industry the benefit of the doubt and said they could do a little bit better than they have, so 85%. But we did a sensitivity analysis there as well, including as high as industry says they ever think they can do. And then we looked at the carbon dioxide capture from the natural gas that's burned to provide the heat and pressure for the process. And for the two commercial plants so far, they've made no effort to do that. They haven't tried to capture that because it's more difficult to do. So we instead had to use data from plants, which they've tried to do it for electric power generation. And we think it's possible, optimistically, to capture 65% of that carbon dioxide. And we did a sensitivity analysis there as well with some optimism. Next slide. This is a busy slide, and I don't want to dwell on it much. I just want to point out that I have been working on methane emissions from the natural gas industry and from shale gas for about 12, 15 years now. And my paper that I'm the first author on from 11 years ago now was the first ever to look at methane emissions from shale gas. That's now the most cited paper by any scientist in the world in this topic. But since our paper came out, it was the first. There are now over 1,700 peer-reviewed papers on this. And there are a variety of different ways we could look at it. And I just want to say that I'm quite confident in the preponderance of this literature that at least 3.5% of the natural gas we consume is emitted to the atmosphere as methane, probably more. And that's the number that we used in our analysis. And the low end number that we used in the sensitivity analysis is really lower than I think any of the data can support. But some scientists think it could be as low as that. Next slide. And this is a really busy slide. I just want to tell you it's right out of the paper. It shows that we looked at the emissions from gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, without any effort to capture the flue gas, the combustion gases from the natural gas, and then blue hydrogen if industry were to try and do that as well. And we do so looking down in terms of the aspects of the steam methane reforming process, both methane and carbon dioxide, the energy needed to drive the system, again, both methane and carbon dioxide, and the energy needed to power the whole process of carbon capture, again, methane and carbon dioxide. Next slide. And this is just an example of the information in there so you can get a feel from it. So we're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions from blue hydrogen as it's been practiced so far by industry, which means they do not capture the flue gases. And for the steam methane process itself, they try to capture carbon dioxide, 85% maybe, but they don't capture all of it. So there's still 5.8 grams carbon dioxide equivalents per megajoule. The emissions of methane are more for the steam process. Then we look at the energy to heat steam, and there's substantial emissions of both carbon dioxide and methane. Same for the energy to drive the carbon capture, somewhat lower, but still substantial. And there's CO2 emissions that are needed to produce natural gas. So we come up with a total of about 139 grams carbon equivalents, and that doesn't mean much to you. I'll put in context in a minute. I just want to say that we really gave the industry the benefit of the doubt here, because we assumed that of the carbon dioxide that's captured, that they are able to permanently store it without leakage, and that it takes no energy and there are no emissions associated with that process of transporting and storing it. That's certainly not true. But we made that assumption because there are no data available as to what those leakage rates and emissions associated with that are. And it would be too much hand waving to put it in. And we wanted to make our paper as bulletproof as possible, so that we knew the industry would be taking a close look, and we didn't want to make it easy for them to pick on something. So we gave them the benefit of it out there. Next slide. And this is really the conclusion of the paper. We're looking here at the comparison of the greenhouse gas footprint of hydrogen and fossil fuels for comparison to generate the same amount of heat energy when you burn it, the same units across the board. Carbon dioxide emissions are in yellow, and the methane emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents are in red. And on the left, we have gray hydrogen, the hydrogen again without any carbon capture. Next bar over is blue hydrogen as it's been practiced to date. And the emissions are lower than gray hydrogen, particularly for carbon dioxide, but not all that much lower. And methane emissions are actually more because it takes more natural gas to do this than for gray hydrogen. The next bar over would be if industry were to try and also capture the combustion emissions, which again, they've never tried to do so far. Carbon dioxide emissions are down, but the methane emissions increase even more because that requires more energy and more methane emissions associated with that. And then for comparison, we have natural gas, diesel, oil, and coal. And the best case, blue hydrogen has a larger greenhouse gas emissions than any fossil fuel. It's worse than just plain burning natural gas. This is not a clean fuel. Next slide. So again, our papers, it's very transparent. It's very conservative, in fact. It's based on these 4 input parameters. We used the best available data, and we performed sensitivity analyses on those. And I want to just run through the sensitivity analysis because I think that's important, because we're very certain of our conclusion. Next slide. So we did 2 types of sensitivity analysis, and this is on the methane emission rate and how one compares methane to carbon dioxide in terms of time. And the baseline analysis for the figure I just showed you is circled there at the red. Those are the numbers behind what I just showed you. The next red oval below that is sort of our worst case, where we assume that methane emissions are higher than in our base case analysis, still realistic values. And we assumed that the methane warming potential compared to carbon dioxide is somewhat worse than our base case. And the number we use here is certainly within the literature value. Some people believe that's the case. So this is entirely plausible scenario, and the emissions of everything go up across the board. Blue hydrogen is still a little bit better than gray hydrogen, but not by much. And it's still far worse than natural gas. In fact, proportionately worse than natural gas under these assumptions. And then for the best case scenario there at the bottom, we go to a very, very low, I think unbelievably low value for methane emissions. And we compare methane to carbon dioxide over a 100-year time period, which I think is inappropriate given the rate of warming that we're seeing, that we're dealing with what needs to be done over the next couple of decades. But those are the analyses. All of the emissions go down on these assumptions. Blue hydrogen is better than gray hydrogen, but still nowhere near zero emissions. And it is still no better than natural gas. There is no advantage in burning it over natural gas, even under these extraordinarily optimistic assumptions. Next slide. We also did sensitivity analysis for carbon dioxide capture rates, and just quickly I've given you the summary of total emissions here. It doesn't really matter how much emissions you assume. It's the total emissions are about the same. As the carbon dioxide emissions go down because industry tries to capture more, and no one thinks they can capture more than 90%. So those are optimistic assumptions. Total emissions are still high because the methane emissions go up. And that's because it takes a lot of energy to capture carbon dioxide, and that energy is coming from natural gas. You're burning more natural gas with more methane emissions to make this work. So again, our conclusions are very robust. Next slide. So I don't want to appear harsh, but I do believe that this blue hydrogen idea, which really is just come about in the last 4 or 5 years and is widely promoted by the oil and gas industry through the Hydrogen Council, I really do think it's greenwashing and a ploy to distract from what we should be doing. I mean, if you go back before this PR campaign, then hydrogen was seen for use in hard to decarbonize energy sectors, air travel again, steel manufacturing. We'll talk about those in a minute. But I think that's been distorted. And the Hydrogen Council and industry across the world now is talking about blending hydrogen in with natural gas in pipelines to heat homes and replacing gas and electric power plants. I think that's a really bad idea. Next slide. Is there a role for green hydrogen? Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about that some more. But even here, it's not entirely clear that we need green hydrogen as much as some proponents would say. And we certainly don't need blue hydrogen for this with its big greenhouse gas footprint. But no matter what one thinks about green hydrogen in, say, making steel or long distance transport, I strongly believe that we should never be using hydrogen for heating in homes and buildings. It's just far better to use electricity directly through high efficiency heat pumps, as I'm doing in my home today, where I'm speaking from in upstate cold New York. Next slide. And just an example of this, here we're comparing the use of green hydrogen. So hydrogen made from electrolysis of renewable energy. On the left, taking that hydrogen to a home and burning it for heat, and on the right for a heat pump. And given the inefficiencies of transporting and burning the hydrogen, you end up with about a 46% useful heat per unit of green hydrogen input if you want to burn the hydrogen. If you instead go with the heat pumps, because heat pumps are extracting energy from the environment and they have extraordinarily high efficiencies because of that, we end up with a 270% efficiency for using renewable electricity to produce the heat with the heat pump compared to 46% for burning it. The heat pump is 6 times more energy for the same electric input. So that's clearly the way we should be going. Next slide. And then finally, beyond low efficiencies, there are many other reasons not to put hydrogen into gas pipeline systems and not to use it in heating homes. And if you're interested in it, there's a really nice video by chemical engineer Paul Martin on this. It's about 20 minutes long, well worth watching, and I'm giving you a link to it there. But basically, there are issues of leakage. Hydrogen's a very, very small molecule. It's far leakier even than methane. So leakage is real. Safety issues are real. Its energy density is a lot less than natural gas, so you can't simply substitute it in without changing the equipment you use in your homes, your stove, your heaters, your furnaces. They'd have to be changed. And hydrogen has issues of making pipes more brittle and more likely to fail. Next slide. So that is my presentation, and I think the thought is I might be able to take a question or two here or there, and then we can go on and talk more about green hydrogen. But exactly. Brian and Joe, it's totally up to you what you'd like me to do.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks so much, Dr. Howarth. I just maybe this is a great slide to kind of emphasize here, the conclusions of your paper that came out last year, and a couple questions that came in from the chat. One, maybe we can put a fine point on it. It's one listener, Linda, says, I appreciate your definitive conclusion that there's no case for blue hydrogen, that it's basically greenwashing by the gas industry. It sounds like green hydrogen is the only justifiable type of hydrogen, correct? Do you want to kind of put a fine point on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I don't lightly, I'm an academic scientist who's used to using conservative language, right? I don't lightly throw around the term greenwashing, but this is a real deliberate effort. I'm convinced that the oil and gas industry knows that you can't really use blue hydrogen and substitute into their pipeline systems and have it replace over time. They know that can't work. The science is just too strong against that. Pipeline embrittlement, the need to replace appliances and all. But what it does is allow people to think, oh, we have to keep that gas infrastructure going into the future. And then meanwhile, we continue to just use natural gas. So I think it's a stalling technique to keep the current fossil gas industry alive. I very strongly believe that. And unfortunately, this promotion by the Hydrogen Council and others has been very effective. Here in the United States, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that became law late last year gives subsidies to blue hydrogen. And the European Union is thinking about subsidizing blue hydrogen, and there's realistic talk that, yeah, this is part of the future. And I think that's the term blue hydrogen is a deliberate confusion with green hydrogen on part of industry. So I think we need to really push back on that and make politicians, make the public understand the difference.
Robert, I just wanted to, a question and maybe to point something out on this chart because I love this chart. I think, and you mentioned it, but I just want to emphasize that part of the reason why blue hydrogen comes out looking so poor in this comparison has to do with the bar chart, the bar there, the natural gas bar there, where you're showing how much of the emissions, the total emissions from natural gas come from the red part, which is that's leaking methane, correct? That's the part of unburned.
It's unburned methane, absolutely. And you're thank you for highlighting that, because since that's both the fuel supplier and the feedstock for all of these hydrogens, the more of it you use, the more methane emissions you're going to get, even if the carbon dioxide capture is effective. But a slight correction, I wouldn't call the methane leakage, well, the methane emissions there, I just did it myself, leakage. Part of it's leakage, a lot of it's just the normal operation of the oil and gas industry. So, for example, when you move gas in a high pressure pipeline, if you want to do maintenance on that pipeline, you have to get the gas out of the pipeline. It's an explosion risk to be welding on it. And what they do is just blow it off to the atmosphere. It's called a blowdown. And it's a large part of what those emissions are comes from that. And there's no technology to get around that. People say, oh, we can find technologies to solve it. Well, no one's come up with that one. So, and so, I'd say about half of the methane emissions associated with the use of natural gas are purposeful routine parts of the operations. The other half, some of them are leaks, but then there are things like, if you're producing surplus gas at a time, industry will flare it off to the atmosphere rather than try and put it into market. And if the flares aren't kept flaring, means burning it. If the flares go out, you're not burning it, then it's unburned methane. And that's a very common problem, to have unlit flares.
Right.
Is that a leak or purposeful? I don't know.
Right,
something
exactly.
in between.
Leaks or purposeful leaks. Yeah. No, good point. But I guess I think the thing that I love about this chart, because I think if you just look at the yellow bars, if you only focus on the yellow bars, I would say that the yellow bars kind of represent the conventional thinking about fossil fuels. In fact, even, like I know this from looking at websites like the EPA. If you go on the EPA and ask how much carbon is produced by burning natural gas, you'll get the yellow bar figure there. You won't get or maybe there'll be a tiny portion of the red mixed in with that. But essentially, I think what this is showing, in part, the reason why the world is still catching up to the realities about methane and how important this leaking and intentional flaring, et cetera, leaking is as an overall portion of the emissions, because it can look relatively decent if you're just looking at the yellow bars. But when you look at the yellow and red combined, then you see things like natural gas is as bad as coal, which I know is something you've been talking about for some time, and you got a lot of criticism for when you first came out with that point of view. But now it seems like the world is catching up to that. Can you just speak a little bit to that? Because you mentioned a little bit with these 17
no, I mean,
papers,
we published the first paper looking at the methane emissions from shale gas as a contributor to the greenhouse gas footprint. It came out in April 12th, 2011. I'll never forget the date. And yeah, we got a huge amount of pushback, a tremendous amount of criticism from that industry. It really upset industry because it upset this whole idea of natural gas as a bridge fuel. It upset the Obama administration. I got a call from the White House within a day or so after our paper came out. They didn't like it at all because they were promoting shale gas as an economic savior and is better than coal. In retrospect, the science has really borne us out. It's first year or so, some of my academic colleagues were pretty critical of what we did too, but there's really, really good data now. And our initial calculations, although speculative, we said they were speculative, turn out to be pretty close now that we're hundreds of studies and much, much better data later. So that's a strong conclusion. And I took that, given the pushback we got from that paper 11 years ago, I went into writing this paper with Mark Jacobson with great care. I knew we would get pushback from the oil and gas industry and others because it really cuts into their latest marketing scheme. And I knew they'd look at it with a very fine-tooth comb. And so we were extremely cautious in our analysis and in our presentation. It's a very conservative paper.
Professor Howarth, yeah, maybe we can take one more and then we'll get to Martina and we'll pivot to kind of green hydrogen and the usages. So Matthew kind of puts in a kind of rebuttal to your study, which I'm sure every study has its rebuttals, and that's how science gets done. So I encourage folks to go to that LinkedIn. But and there's a couple different points and critiques of your study from last year. One of them is kind of on the assumption, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot, and you were, I think, just referencing it, on the high emissions, the 3% emissions of methane leakage. Could you comment on that and on how, and answer some of your critics on?
Yeah, well, let me say there are different types of critics. In the time our paper has come out, there have been 2 other peer-reviewed papers on the topic, and they actually agree with us. And there's nothing in the peer-reviewed literature which criticizes us so far. And so the criticisms that you're referring to are, they're in Twitter, they're in LinkedIn, they're in Facebook, and whatever. I don't generally respond to those because I think we should be doing science through the peer-reviewed literature and not through Twitter. I will occasionally respond to Twitter, but that's not primarily where we should be. On the methane emission rate, though, I have seen what people say on Twitter, and we used a 3.5% baseline rate. So our sensitivity analysis was down to 1.54% emission rate. Same conclusion as I just showed you with that emission rate, because natural gas emissions go down as well. All of the peer-reviewed literature shows emissions have to be at least that much. So I get critics who really don't follow the methane literature at all closely, and they say, well, in Norway or in the Netherlands, we think it's 0.002% or something. Whatever, there's no scientific evidence backing that up, absolutely none. The best data comes from the United States, and that 3.5 number that I've given you there is a conservative estimate for the United States. People say, well, in Europe, it might be lower. Perhaps it's lower in Norway and the Netherlands. I wouldn't doubt that because it wouldn't surprise me. But again, there are not reputable peer-reviewed data backing that up. And I would point out that for those who live in Europe, most of the natural gas is not coming from the Netherlands and Norway. It's coming from Russia. It's coming from Kazakhstan. It's coming from LNG from the United States. And when you transport natural gas as LNG, the emissions go up because there's a huge energy cost associated with that. So the natural gas in Europe that's coming from the US via LNG would have at least a 25% bigger greenhouse gas footprint than what I've said here. And the best data show that the emissions from Russia are higher than that, again, as is Kazakhstan. So I think it's meaningless to say, oh, well, in Norway, we might have a little bit of the lower methane emissions. That's not what Europe in general is seeing. It's not what the world is seeing. The other number I put in there is based on the change in the carbon isotopic composition of methane globally over the last couple of decades, a paper I published in 2019. And that shows that the global methane emission from the oil and gas industry is at least 3.5%. So I'm quite convinced of that number. And people who don't work in the area can say all they want on LinkedIn, but yeah. Great. What more can I say? I find it frustrating.
Yeah. Thanks for the answer.
Well, thanks. I'm sure we'll have time for a few more questions at the end, but we should probably move on, do you think, Joe? And so let me stop sharing and invite Martina to share her screen and her presentation.
Yeah, and we'll pivot to green hydrogen. Thanks, Martina.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you again, Professor Howarth, for helping us model this specific scenario of CCUS with that technology that was available at that time. And as we know, technologies is doing big advancements in all sorts of sector, and this also is happening in the hydrogen industry. And we're very excited to, having your model and analysis and, maybe using this study as a timestamp and be able to compare it with current, existing, and future technology for CCUS that will be available or is available in the near future. So my presentation today will be focusing again on clean hydrogen. This is the topic, and I'm working for the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance, which is based out of Portland, Oregon. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance, our mission is to promote and advocate using renewable electricity to produce hydrogen and climate neutral derivative fuels. Our focus is here in the Northwest of the United States, and we currently have more than 75 members, which range from local nonprofits, OEMs, utilities, clean energy and clean transportation advocacy groups, renewable energy and renewable hydrogen developers, and even a Native American tribe, and other ancillary services. So just to visualize again how a renewable hydrogen is produced, this is a very simplified visual that I grabbed from the internet, which kind of shows like you using renewable electricity, and that might vary within each jurisdiction how this is defined. That might be solar, wind, geothermal, offshore wind, that might be different hydropower. So again, it depends how each jurisdiction defines renewable energy. And then you take this electricity that you have been creating, and you put it through a device that is called an electrolyzer. And what this device does is it takes the electricity and it shoots it through water. And in this process, what is happening, there is a chemical reaction, and it kind of divides that electricity into oxygen, which is released into the air, and hydrogen, which is being captured because it's a very valuable energy that we have today. It can be used in different areas. So often when we talk about hydrogen, we say that it can decarbonize hard to decarbonize sectors. But sometimes what are these hard to decarbonize sectors, and where can it actually be used? And some of us have mentioning hydrogen, they say that's kind of like this a Swiss Army knife, because it has so many different applications, which sectors it can serve and help to decarbonize. And as you can read, a few that have been mentioned here are obviously aviation. Currently our jet fuel is based on fossil energy. Shipping, we're looking at the ships, the cargo ships, the cruise ships, ferries. So all types of marine applications, freight in particular, we're looking at long distance and trucks that are very attractive to decarbonize with hydrogen, as well as other applications within the industry. We often forget that hydrogen is often used as a industrial feedstock for a lot of products that we are producing. That might be cement, that might be steel, that might be fertilizer. So there are some things that are extremely hard to decarbonize by using electrons, so using electricity, and that's where the molecule like hydrogen can come in and help. And again, these are applications that are a good fit for hydrogen, but do not necessarily need to be used. So hydrogen is a missing puzzle piece within this goals that we have that will help us to get to decarbonize all the different sectors that we have. So what I wanted to show with this slide, and I think Professor Howarth has been talking a little bit about this, there are a lot of colors of hydrogen, and I don't know who had the idea to put these labels on. And when I started this working in this industry about 3 years ago, it was first like, what is hydrogen? What is renewable hydrogen? What is the difference? And then people were throwing in the colors, and there was a discussion of green versus blue versus gray, and then pink came to it. And, like every other month, I'm hearing about a new color. It's white hydrogen, yellow hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, brown hydrogen, and it's like, okay, what color are we missing? Is it purple? Is it beige? It's kind of getting very confusing. And in addition to that, people start talking about clean hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, low carbon intensity hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen. So nobody like is able to like follow what is what. And I think an approach that you think the scientists and academic and the researchers, and we can agree, is using numbers is a great way to measure and quantify some of the things that we want to achieve. So recently the Bipartisan Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act mentioned a definition of clean hydrogen. And as you can read here in the slide, so the standard shall define clean hydrogen to mean hydrogen produced with a carbon intensity equal to or less than 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent produced at the site of production per kilogram of hydrogen produced. So again, it doesn't use any colors, but it uses numbers to measure and quantify what we want to achieve. Further talking about what's happening on federal level here in the United States, is we did not really have much, there was not much happening on federal level in terms of policy. We have within the DOE, we have a hydrogen fuel cell technology office. Most of the projects in the past have been focusing on research and development, but finally, this May, May 15th, we're looking forward to the hydrogen roadmap and strategy that's supposed to be released from the government of the United States. And in addition, the US DOE has established this hydrogen shot initiative last year, which kind of aims for bringing down the cost of the hydrogen to $1 per 1 kilogram of hydrogen in 1 decade. And if you're wondering how much hydrogen currently costs, it's about $5 per kilogram. So in addition to that hydrogen shot and the hydrogen roadmap and strategy that the federal government is working on, furthermore, there is additional money in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. In particular, what the hydrogen industry is excited about are these $8 billion for the regional clean hydrogen hubs. And we know that there'll be at least 4 of them. So we're definitely excited, and we hear there is a lot of competition going on between the different states, and a lot of guessing who might get these billions of dollars into their corner of the United States. So now let's talk a little bit about the Pacific Northwest. That's kind of where our organization is very active in, and what makes it such a good and perfect place, we would say, for renewable hydrogen. So our region is blessed with several of the attributes needed to be at the forefront advancing clean energy and clean fuels. Our governments are very progressive. We have a lot of abundant renewable resources. we have a lot of hydropower, for those who are unfamiliar with our region, that makes up the majority of our clean energy resources, obviously wind and power. But in addition to that, we're also very much excited about the new renewable energy sources that will be coming online, such as offshore wind or offshore floating wind into our region. And obviously, we have a lot of low power rates, and we have very active environmental justice advocacy groups who certainly, fight the good fight for good climate policy in our region. And there is significant demand for hydrogen in our area, such as agriculture and heavy duty land transport, and a lot of maritime industries in the region. So what we would say, if we talk about state policy in Oregon and Washington State, is that we have like a trifecta of climate policy. We have 100% clean energy goals. We have a cap and trade, or cap and invest, that exists in Washington and also in California, and we have a low carbon fuel standard. So renewable hydrogen is explicitly included as a compliance mechanism in Washington State. And just to give you an idea where these projects are happening in the United States, obviously there's a lot of projects, and so these are electrolyzer projects. So again, this is more focused on renewable hydrogen. A lot of projects on the East Coast and in California, but we're also seeing some bigger developments in Washington State. And going back to that slide, this has been a DOE slide from June 2021. And just a couple of months later, I've been starting to collect the projects that have been publicly announced. And obviously, there's much more going on in the back of renewable hydrogen and fuel cell project announcements in the Pacific Northwest. So back in, this was in, I think, November or December, I have counted 22 projects just in Oregon and Washington. And obviously, there are a lot of hydropower and wind and wave to hydrogen projects that are happening. There are utilities that are will be producing hydrogen through their hydropower. There are wind farms that will be producing hydrogen. So it's kind of a mix, and every project has a different purpose to serve. And then we have also fuel cell backup systems. We see that in hospitals, we see that in high schools, we see that in data centers. A lot of like the big tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, they have large data centers which require a lot of long duration backup energy. So this is something definitely very attractive, an attractive solution to have, because sometimes batteries, lithium ion batteries, are not able to provide such long duration backup energy as fuel cells are. So other projects that we see are, for example, Tacoma Power, a municipal utility in Washington, has probably the world's first, maybe, or at least in the United States, so first electrofuels tariff, which is trying to attract the renewable hydrogen industry and the clean fuels industry into the region. And we also have a first fueling station that is being built this year around Chehalis, and the hydrogen to that fueling station will be provided by renewable hydrogen created from these hydropower dams, hydropower to hydrogen fuel that will be trucked from East Wenatchee to Chehalis. And there are also different transit agencies that are currently, will be deploying fuel cell buses different port applications, obviously like the warehouses, we have like the Amazons and Costco's in the area, and those there are different applications within the warehouses that need to be zero emission. So there are definitely a variety of industries and projects that are using renewable hydrogen in our area. Some of the things that I've been talking about had been summarized in the Pacific Northwest Renewable Hydrogen Action Plan that has been released last May. But again, this was just a time shot snap kind of that time. And again, so much has changed since May that it's almost like outdated, like you would have to, every year you would have to technically update it, make a new roadmap, because so much is happening, so many new projects are coming online, that the conversation and the discussion around hydrogen or renewable hydrogen or clean hydrogen is changing constantly. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We'll also be organizing our Renewable Power to Clean Fuels Symposium in Montana and Missoula in May 2022. So we hope to connect with you in person. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Martina. Great. I know we're a little time. Maybe we can go a couple more minutes and just talk, about pivot to questions. Oh,
Martina, I think your camera might be turned off, Martina. But I wanted to clarify one thing about the those projects you mentioned in the Northwest. Are all of them using renewable, like what we would call green hydrogen from this presentation, or is it varied? Some using hydrogen from other sources now, like some, or is it a mix?
You're muted, Martina.
Yes, I'm muted. So the ones that I've been highlighting here are mostly renewable hydrogen projects. Most of them have been announced, so not all of them are in practice yet. So the Douglas County Public Utility District 5 megawatt electrolyzer on the dam in Wenatchee is currently being built. It has all its off-takers, like the hydrogen fueling station. So this will be a large supplier of hydrogen for the region, which will be supplying a lot of these applications that have announced operation or interest. And then, there are other funds that have been granted, for example, through the Department of Commerce for fuel cells, like fuel cell backup system for that high school. So, these are currently being built, and this supply for the hydrogen is not yet created. The renewable hydrogen supply is not yet created, but, we're looking forward to the end of this year. And as these other projects that are there, certainly, will be able to supply it with renewable hydrogen. There are other projects that I have not mentioned. There are some industries that are currently using fossil hydrogen, but again, there will be an opportunity to decarbonize these as well.
Thank you.
Great. And, a lot of folks are asking about the potential, and maybe Robert and Martina can comment on this, on hydrogen, hydrogen being used to store excess power from renewable energy. Can both of you comment on that potential and how important you see that as being hydrogen as being a storage mechanism?
Yeah, I can briefly say I think hydrogen is a very good way to store surplus renewable electricity, and then can be fed back into the grid through fuel cells. To me, that is perhaps one of the very, very few really clear cases where we should be using hydrogen. I mean, quite frankly, of the Swiss Army knife that we saw from Liebrecht Associates, 2/3 of those, I think, either shouldn't be done for hydrogen or there's some better way to do it. So I do worry about over promotion of hydrogen, and I must comment, I'm discouraged by this use of the term clean hydrogen, which has come out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because it deliberately confuses the green hydrogen with blue hydrogen. And the targets which are set in there were set by the oil and gas industry, and it specifies it'll be done using out-of-date counting methods that the Department of Energy has been done. So, for example, methane emissions are based on 25-year-old data. It doesn't include any of the 1,700 papers that have been produced over the last year. And it compares methane with carbon dioxide emissions over a 100-year time period. And at that, it uses it from the 2008 IPCC assessment instead of the most recent one. So it understates the importance of methane by 50-fold or something like that. So that target is set deliberately to allow blue hydrogen, and the blue hydrogen, I believe, will have the footprint I presented, not what the Department of Energy is using in those calculations. So I hope that anyone who really is interested in green hydrogen will understand that difference and work to counteract that and help us do better. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with fossil hydrogen in this country. Green hydrogen won't be able to even compete, and it'll be hugely bad for the climate.
Do we have any understanding about what the relative costs of using our color wheel, our blue hydrogen carbon capture and storage methods for producing hydrogen versus renewable energy methods of producing hydrogen? Is there a possibility, any hope that the renewable hydrogen might actually be cheaper in the long run than carbon capture and storage, or is that
in the long run, once the price of renewable electricity comes down sufficiently? And I don't know what the break-even point will be, and it'll vary by country. Here in the U.S., natural gas prices are what, half to a third of what they are in Europe, for instance. So there'll be a different dynamic in Europe than here. But currently and for the foreseeable future, green hydrogen can't compete economically with gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen in the United States.
And coming back to the question of access renewable energy, and this was kind of like the founding idea of the founder of our organization, Ken Dragoon. He realized there is so much access renewable hydrogen that we have here in the Pacific Northwest specifically. And I just pulled up a number here from the DOE for the Pacific Northwest. They say we have 18 terawatt hours per year access renewable power. A lot of that comes to the hydropower system that we have. It's sometimes we just don't have the use for the demand to use all the renewable electricity that we are producing at times, and we cannot sell it to our neighboring state because they also don't have a demand. So what are we doing? We're literally wasting the renewable electricity. So if you would be able to put an electrolyzer to that dam, or that would be otherwise wasting that energy, you're providing more value and making this renewable energy source more attractive, because for example, such a dam operator has now an additional possibility to add revenue to its operations, just as an idea. So this kind of provides value to your renewable energy source, and I think this is kind of seen now. We see that with the offshore wind discussion that is definitely happening in Scotland, and we see similar trends also to be potentially swapping over to here to the United States, as we see this is happening all around the world. The US is just playing catch up with.
I think the point you're making there, which I think is a really important one, which is that any renewable energy system, whether it's hydro, wind, or solar, is going to be just a fact of operating that is that you will have sort of boom and bust cycles of energy generation, where sometimes you've got too much, sometimes you don't have enough. And so if as you know, the only way to get a sufficient amount is to build too much renewable energy generation, most likely. So you will have these times where there is more than we need. And so, as you say, attaching electrolyzers to that is a great way of capturing that excess energy, and that holds the promise potentially to lower the cost of green hydrogen so that it can be more cost competitive with these other sources, I would hope. Yes.
And yes, and another really important thing that we have to think about as we're, on this 100% clean energy goal that we have in Oregon and Washington, we will have to build out more and more renewable energy. And this requires also transmission lines, which, to help bring that renewable energy from one side of the mountains to the other side of the mountains. And it takes time to build these transmission lines, which are currently already congested. So another potential opportunity for electrolyzers is to site them and and release this congestion a little bit in the meantime while we're building out these transmission lines, and be able then again to store renewable hydrogen, maybe in a rural area where it could be used to produce locally fertilizer and create a new industry. So there are certainly a lot of great applications and uses for electrolyzers.
Martina, real quick on on Professor Howarth's point, that if we just define it as clean hydrogen, and we do risk the blue hydrogen that has been studied so far and shows enormous risk to the climate, sneaking in there as under the umbrella of clean hydrogen. How do you see us avoiding that mistake and making sure that the clean hydrogen is actually clean?
Well, we have these numbers, right? The carbon intensity, and I mean, we have this for the low carbon fuel standard, looking at all sorts of fuels. So I think being able to measure it and quantify it, making sure, on a carbon intensity standard is helpful, certainly. So, we're trying to stay away from these colors again, which are very confusing. So whatever technology will be able to perform in a clean way will be eligible to tax incentives, production tax credits, whatever, and others will be will be maybe considered as risky investments. It's not people who are developing these projects have to provide some kind of value, like who wants to invest, which type of investor wants to invest into a risky project, so there are a lot of strings attached in order to make such a project happen. And clearly we're trying to stay away and move away from fossil fuels. So this was what the investment industry is clearly also doing, dropping their fossil projects in their portfolios.
Right.
I just need to restate that I totally disagree. I think we should keep the colors and get rid of the misleading and perhaps wrong term clean. The clean definition in the bipartisan infrastructure bill includes blue hydrogen, which is far, far from clean. And so let's drop that purposeful confusion and stick with green. If people want to promote green and renewable hydrogen, I'm with you. If you want to promote clean hydrogen and play into the playbook of the oil and gas industry and bring along blue hydrogen, that's just a terrible idea in my opinion. So I totally disagree with what Martina just said.
I think what we're talking about is that, the numbers are good if the measurement system is good. And if the measurement system is not good, then the numbers aren't very helpful. So I think, and I feel like what we're poking at here is something that you've been heavily researching for many years, Professor Howarth, which is that our measuring systems aren't very good for really understanding the carbon intensity of some of these things that we've been using in huge volumes. And if you're not accurately measuring the carbon emissions from these things, then the numbers aren't that helpful.
And I think one should be skeptical of the numbers which are in the bipartisan bill, because you can, those very clearly are traceable to the oil and gas industry. If you watch the discussions going on behind the scene, it is set to just allow for blue hydrogen. It's very
Mm.
clearly. So
Well,
using
it
data
would be
counting.
simpler to just say, yeah, I mean, Martina, but if hydrogen comes from renewable energy that with no carbon emissions, then it's like everybody's for it, right? And if it comes from fossil fuels, then we're not for it, right? Is it as simple as that, and we don't have to confuse the issue?
Yeah, we certainly need to make sure we're considering all clean technologies that will help us get to our goals. There are so many coming online. Hydrogen produced from algae. There is always something new. I'm learning. Is this considered green? Is this considered renewable? I don't know. It's clean, probably yes. So there are so many different things to consider, and I always say it's not a climate buffet, it's a climate emergency. So, we need all hands on deck and consider all clean solutions. And, that's not up to me to define them, but, we are a democracy. And so we hope we can all work together to, get to our decarbonization goals.
Okay, well, I think that's
Great.
great
Well,
work.
we should probably wrap it up here, I think. Don't you think, Joe? We're a little over
Yeah.
time, and this has been a really interesting conversation. Really, I think we've kind of got to the heart of one of the biggest issues with hydrogen here, right here in the conversation, which is really good. Did you have any thoughts to add, Joe, as we wrap up here?
Just huge thanks to our panelists. This is a great conversation. We need to be having this, so thank you both so much for being on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Professor Howarth.
Thank you for
Thanks so much
sponsoring.
for all the work you've been doing, and thank you, Martina, for advocating for the best possible uses of hydrogen. So thank you both, and thank you for your time today. And thank you all for tuning in today. And as we like to say, good luck with all your electrification projects, and we hope to see you next time for Sequestration Week 2.
Thanks so much, all.